I'm very pleased to be here, very pleased to be invited to be here, and I come rather like the Macedonian who appeared to Paul in a dream and urged Paul to come over to Macedonia. Because I'm urging you, my point and purpose is to urge you to write books about Zwingli in English. Because there are so few. So that really is my purpose. A few biographical things about Zwingli for the people who watch on the YouTube. Zwingli was born on the 1st of January of 1884, as you'll recall. Lived the life of a learned humanist and Catholic priest until his awakening to reforming impulses shortly after the catastrophe of Marignano in 1515. And eventually wound up in Zurich in 1519, living in a house a few doors down from where we presently are. His impact then was profound, and now, at least in an American context, he's hardly known. And that, to me, is a shame. In fact, there's more misinformation about Zwingli than there are facts known. And I want to now discuss some of the Zwingli myths so present in American culture. The first Zwingli myth is that that night that Froschauer and his workers were preparing and printing during Lent, and they were very tired and very busy and exhausted, that they were fed sausages, and that Zwingli too consumed sausages. But of course, you all know that he didn't. But one of the most prevalent myths is that he broke the Lenten fast, and so inaugurated the Reformation by this activity. The second myth is that he was utterly dependent on Luther. This may come as a surprise to you, but in an American context, at least in the South, where I presently live, the idea that Luther is the teacher of Zwingli is almost widely accepted. This is odd because Zwingli's own testimony, as you'll recall, is that he began his reformatory efforts earlier than anyone had ever heard of Luther. My opinion is that he began reforming or tending towards reform in 1515, again, shortly after the Battle at Marignano, because this affected him so profoundly. The things that happened at that battle, where he was serving as a chaplain, led him to object to mercenary service. And in objecting to mercenary service, the leaders of Glarus were kind of disappointed in him, to put it mildly, because they made rather a lot of money from mercenary service. So by preaching against mercenary activity, Zwingli was putting himself at odds with the leaders of the town. This, I believe, is the reason that he left Glarus and went to Einsiedeln, where he continued reading, he continued studying, he became more acquainted with Greek, he began reading more widely in the Bible than in the Church Fathers. He adopted Erasmian hermeneutical techniques in his reading of Scripture, and all of this is formulating well before 1517, and well before anybody had heard of Luther. So when he arrives in 1519 in Zurich, he's already set in his mind that the church needs to be changed in a more evangelical fashion. And he decided to, as you'll recall, read through and preach through the Gospel of Matthew straight on through without following the lectionary. This, to many Americans, seems like no big deal. But for Zwingli's time, it was quite a revolutionary activity. So he begins to reform in his mind in 1515. He begins to manifest his reformatory ideas in 1516 and 17, and when he moves from Einsiedeln to Zurich, he puts it into practice. He begins reforming worship, and he does it in a meticulous and quite careful way. He carefully and slowly attempts to change the attitudes and change the behaviors of the people of Zurich, and he doesn't overwhelm them or offend them as the Anabaptists tended to, and he sought to reform more methodically and more carefully. So one of the myths that needs to be debunked in an American context is this idea that he's dependent on Luther and he gets all of his ideas from Luther. And so if you want to understand Zwingli, you have to understand Luther, which is totally incorrect. The third myth that often crops up in an American context regarding Zwingli is that he drowned Anabaptists. And of course, you know as well as anyone that he did no such thing. It was the city council that passed the verdict. It was the city council that took the victims out into the Lamad and tossed them overboard. Zwingli, in fact, pleaded for many of these people who had been either condemned to exile or condemned to death. He was on their side in terms of religious freedom. He just didn't believe that they should have advanced as quickly as they wanted to. The fourth, and probably the most widespread misunderstanding about Zwingli, is that he was a combatant at Kappel, and that too is not accurate. He was there serving as a chaplain to the troops, as he had done in 1515. He was not a combatant. He was killed. I'll go Zwingli in here for a moment. He was killed by the horrible papists who cruelly murdered him for no good reason and hacked to pieces and burned. But that wasn't because he was fighting with the sword. It was because he was the opponent of the faith, the great heretic. So these are some of the myths that are commonplace. These are commonplace misunderstandings about Zwingli in America, in conversations with people in America and in conversations with Americans who don't really know that much about Zwingli in the first place. But they have these ideas, and once somebody has an idea, it's very difficult to misplace it or displace it with the truth. It's often like a newspaper story will be run on the front page, and they'll have blaring giant headlines, and they'll tell a story, and then they'll retract it. But it's always back on page 6 or 7 in little tiny print that nobody's going to see. We are so struck by first impressions that the truth often has a hard time making its way through. And this is certainly the case in America. And again, remember, my purpose is to urge you to write books about Zwingli in English, because my compatriots need to understand who Zwingli is and what he did and how he understood things. And there's just simply not enough of it. So now I want to mention for just a few minutes Zwingli in higher ed in America. Tellingly, I've been unable to discover a single course in any North American institution of higher education which focuses on the theology of Zwingli or his life or any aspect of his teaching. There are multiple courses on Calvin. There are multiple courses on Luther. There is not a single course dedicated to Zwingli. Now, of course, Zwingli is covered in church history, and he's covered in the Reformation, but it's always quite brief. If Luther gets that much treatment, and Calvin gets that much treatment, Zwingli gets that much treatment. It is astonishing that not only is he overlooked, but virtually ignored in courses in university. And it is quite unfortunate because he has so much to offer theologically and so much to offer as a biography. He has really important things to say, I wrote, you know his name, I'm not going to mangle it. This wonderful young fellow here mentioned my little book that introduces Zwingli. Other than that, besides Bruce Gordon's book that he's presently writing, there hasn't been a biography of Zwingli written in the United States since 1976. Before that, the only biographies of Zwingli that were written in the United States in English were by Jackson and Macaulay. What's the other one? No, that's not his name. Jackson, S.M. Jackson, Samuel Macaulay Jackson. Yes. His book was published in the early 1900s, if I recall. So it predates the present by over a century. So between early 1900s and the present day, one major biography of Zwingli has been written by Potter in 1976. Nothing else exists. And none of the excellent biographies of Zwingli written in German have been translated except, so far as I know, Ulrich Gabler's. All the rest have remained untranslated. Oscar Farner's beautifully written 4-volume biography of Zwingli has never been translated. The great work by Gottfried Locker has never been translated. None of those things exist in America in English, and consequently, there's this massive gap in American students' knowledge of who Zwingli was and what he did. And so again, I plead with you, write some books about Zwingli in English, publish them so that our folks can read them. We live in a time in America right now where we're getting dumber by the day almost. We've elected Trump. We are managing somehow to out-Brexit Brexit. We're withdrawing from the world stage. We're isolating ourselves more and more. And it seems to me that Zwingli has rather a lot to say of all of those kinds of situations. His theology is very on point in an American culture these days. So write some stuff about Zwingli. There are a couple of other things. There was a source book, a Reformation source book, Documents from an Age of Debate by Michael Bruning, written in 2017, but it includes Zwingli very little, doesn't include a biography, doesn't include material from his theology, doesn't include much of anything. Ulrich Zwingli, Shepherd Warrior by William Bogenstein is a children's book that was written in 2016. But unfortunately, in spite of being urged not to, he carries on the tradition of talking about Zwingli, the warrior who went into battle and who died in conflict. I guess that makes a better children's story. You want to have soldiers out on the battlefield and not chaplains saying the Lord's Prayer of the troops. It makes for a better, exciting story. Again, prior to these, one has to look back to the 19th and early 20th centuries to find translations of Zwingli's work by the likes of Simpson and Jackson. The few volumes that treat Zwingli's theology by our friend Peter Stevens are themselves decades old now. So there's not been a biography of Zwingli written since '76. There's not been a theology of Zwingli written in America or in English, and it's not even by an American, since Peter Stevens did his work on Zwingli. There's a dearth. I was quite taken by Emilio Campi's discussion the other day about how there was just this glut of material in German, and a lot of it's on the table back there. You can read and understand and learn all manner of things about Zwingli if you read German, but again, my compatriots that attend to, they sometimes have a hard time reading English. So I suppose that's why they like Trump. Not to be political. But to keep it in the Zwinglian mode, as he was sometimes political himself, I look forward to Bruce's volume, but I don't know how large it'll be. For instance, Martin Brecht wrote that wonderful 3-volume biography of Luther. I don't think in existence there is a multi-volume treatment of Zwingli's life, except in German. Oscar Farner again comes to mind, but nobody reads that anymore in America because they don't read German. So consequently, things are dire. I'm trying to paint a dire picture of destitution and depravity. We live in a dark land where no light shines, and we need you to come over and enlighten us with your wisdom of Zwinglianism. Please come, the Macedonian cry. We need you. There is, however, some good news, for which I'm sure you'll be happy. And the good news is that in the Eucharistic conference, the Eucharistic conflict, Zwingli won in America. And I say that because of non-Catholic denominations, the largest are Baptist denominations. And whether Baptists know it or not, their understanding of the Lord's Supper comes directly from Zwingli. It is his understanding of the Lord's Supper that wins out in an American context. It's not the Lutherans. They're a tiny minority. The Calvinists, the Presbyterians, old and new, are a smaller group, but there are 14 million Southern Baptists, and there are 35 or more other Baptist denominations floating around the country because we Americans never agree on anything, so we all have our own denomination, basically. But this is the largest group of non-Catholics in the country, and their adoption of Zwingli's understanding of the Lord's Supper shows his importance. However, they're unaware of the fact that their understanding comes from Zwingli and not from Luther. In fact, many of them confuse consubstantiation with Zwingli's view, and if you ask them their view of the Lord's Supper, you give them multiple choice questions: consubstantiation, transubstantiation, memorial. They will oftentimes, Baptist people, check consubstantiation. Who knows why? I know why. Because they don't know Zwingli. And they won't know Zwingli until you good people write books on Zwingli in English. Please send your books in English on Zwingli. I know you can do it. You speak English wonderfully. So write those books on Zwingli. Write some biographies. Write some theologies. Update, argue, debate. Write from your own point of view. Do us all a favor and contribute to our poor folk and their need of a deeper, better, more profound understanding of who Zwingli was. Zwingli, in my opinion, my studied opinion, is too little known, too little appreciated, too little understood, and too little studied in North America, in America in particular. My plea, again, is that you change that by writing and then writing some more and then by writing some more until there are as many books in English about Zwingli as there are about Calvin and Luther. So you have quite a lot of work to do. Best to get busy. He is not unworthy of the attention, after all. And you, good people, are in the best position to do something about it. Do something about it, I plead with you. That's my talk. Oh yeah, sure. Yay me. Yes, you get out early. Yay. Students always love that. He wants to ask questions, but you don't have any questions. Because I've answered them all. Oh no, question.
I wonder if the people in Pennsylvania who came over from Europe thought they persecuted, unfortunately, in Europe, or English non-conformists and so on. All these people have no idea of Zwingli.
Well, my main emphasis is on the people I know, the Baptist folk. I don't know very many Mennonites, and I don't know very many Presbyterians. I should, but I try to avoid Presbyterians because they were so Calvinistic. But my familiarity, my focus was on Baptists and their lack, because it's the largest group of Protestants in America. But I'm sure that an investigation of Mennonite and Presbyterian understanding of Zwingli would probably result in the same kind of outcome. People are very unfamiliar with.
Presbyterian do understand Zwingli, and I do.
Did you say that the Presbyterian parishes in North America, they do understand? Or
It's not been my experience. I have very much understanding.
I see.
I'm sure that there are some. I'm sure that in my experience, but she's a Presbyterian.
I'm a Presbyterian, and I can tell you that Zwingli is unknown among Presbyterians. Even among Presbyterians, because Calvin dominates and they have no idea really, except for maybe some of these myths in case they've ever heard anything about Zwingli. In fact, they might even think that he's someone who hammered down images, an iconoclast or something like that, some wild guy. But the Pennsylvania Anabaptists do know about Zwingli, and some of them respect him a lot. But they're sorry that he changed and then started to persecute them. So they think that they were personally persecuted by Zwingli.
Which is interesting because it shows that even among people who know Zwingli pretty well, these myths about him are abiding. They're so difficult to root out once they're planted.
I think it is common that the name Zwingli is infamous because of these two things you have mentioned. But you mentioned, I think, an important point. Zwingli has won. And I think this is true. Of course, it's a little bit short way to say it. I once told to a scholar in Germany, I do not know any Swiss Catholic who has not a Zwinglian understanding of the Eucharist.
Yeah.
That's true. And then he told me, I do not know any Lutheran in Germany who does not have the Swiss understanding of the Eucharist. And I think it is quite similar. You made an allusion in the United States, and it's not only the Eucharist, it's a lot of theological thoughts. Calvin has not one single thought which was not thought before him in the Zurich Reformation. Decades before, not one single. But in an anonymous way, so Zwingli had an influence, but not as a person, and the reasons are quite obvious, of course.
Yeah, this is the problem for me. This is the thing that I find so galling, that Zwingli is so poorly known simply because not enough material about him has been published. Now this leads us into a sort of catch-22 with the publishers, because they will say, well, there's not enough interest in Zwingli to publish a book from Erdman's or from Fortress or one of the other big publishers in America. So we can't publish it because there's not enough interest. Well, there won't be interest until you publish books. I mean, how do you generate interest? You can teach courses so that university educators could and should offer courses on the theology of Zwingli. I think the last person to do that was Karl Barth, and I think he did it just because Charlotta wanted him to. I don't know about all that, but it's clear that even in other contexts, Zwingli courses dedicated specifically to him, a course on the theology of Zwingli, you can't find one. You can't find one anywhere. And I think that by having courses like that, you generate interest. And when you generate interest, then publishers become interested. So I think it really needs to begin with the academics, because when the academics present a need, publishers will meet it, rather than the other way around. Publishers, and we have a publisher here, publishers generally don't just come up with ideas and say, well, let's just do this, because it'll be fun. They have to make money from the books they sell. And if you have a bunch of courses on the theology of Zwingli all across America, then some publisher is going to say, we need to fill this gap, because nothing has been written since Peter Stevens in the 80s. So we need to do something about that.
Jim, thank you very much for your invitation to all come to the States. But with you as being the Zwingli missionary in the States, you don't need us. And I think maybe you might expect too much from writing and publishing books, and the publisher can speak for themselves. But then you need people to read books.
Sure.
I think that is a problem. I think a movie is more effective. You know, I think it's the same with you as it does. You don't ask students if they've read the book. You ask if they've seen the movie.
Yeah.
So that's a problem. Besides, we cannot leave the continent, Jim, because we have to be here as missionaries ourselves. Don't think that our people know who Zwingli is. See, if we follow the window, like you said, we fall down because, in a way, we are in an ivory tower. For Switzerland, maybe different, but Netherlands, who knows Zwingli? That is not relevant. They don't even know Luther. They think that's a black guy who was shot sometime. that's correct. So, I was at Saint Thomas, the Church of Martin Butzer, in Strasbourg. So I was a student then, and I was not sure, so I asked the janitor, is this the church where Martin Butzer served? He says, I don't know, I worked here only for 2 years. So it's a similar situation. But there is one relief for you. There is an English book published in the States. And you can find it if you go to the website of Reformation Heritage Books. It's a book by William Fugestein. The book has been endorsed by Peter Opitz and by Luca Basciera.
Very thin.
Thin book, 164 pages. For students, that's massive. And so it is there. Yeah?
Okay.
Go get it.
Thank you for that very much. Yes, ma'am.
So, as I listen to these myths, I keep thinking,
As I listen to the myths, in my mind I think, well, those can be easily corrected. That can be easily. So, I mean, this is, but like you said, I do hear you when you say sometimes when people get something stuck in their mind, it's very hard to change. So I get that. But going beyond the publishing, or even beyond the movie for a little bit, since you know Zwingli and you know the American context, what do you think, if you could say one thing to the American context about Zwingli that's sort of attractive? Like, what would be attractive to the American context to